Now I want to go to a couple selected items of cost. Either because I think they're common items that are either misunderstood, misclassified, or sometimes present problems for you guys presenting invoices. The super circular in general is very anti-advertising. It will tell you all the reasons why you cannot bill advertising. All the reasons in limits, literally, if you read the super circular verbatim, to recruitment of personnel, procurement advertisements, or equipment disposal. There is what the super circular says are legitimate advertising expenses. Advertising just to promote the agency, the program, the department is generally an unallowable expense. We in transit spend a lot of money in advertising, don't we? We need to promote community understanding of our services. We need to print round schedule brochures. And we run demand response services. We tend to produce rider guides, how to access the system, how to call up, make a reservation. We produce little pamphlets about what you can and cannot do on board system vehicles. We do all that, don't we? So, are those expenses allowable? I was recently out in Grand Junction, Colorado, working on their de minimis rate. And I realized they were not billing FTA for their advertising costs. And I asked them why, and they said, our chief financial officer said advertising is unallowable under the super circular. And I said, she's right. But advertising is an allowable expense under FTA guidelines. And now, with the FAST Act, we actually have some specific blessing of advertising as an eligible expense. So advertising, generally, if you just talk to a general grants manager, they'll tell you advertising isn't allowable. It is allowable under FTA programs.
That's good.
What's that?
That's good because we have a marketing, we used to have a marketing line item.
Yeah, years ago, there was a series of correspondence between FTA and GAO, or OMB, I believe it was, excuse me. Because there is a general allowance, if it's in furtherance of a program purpose, they will permit advertising. And FTA jumped on that little language and said transit couldn't survive without communicating to the general public what the transit system does. And that's the original source of blessing. And I think with the issuance of the super circular, all of a sudden it kicked up the mud a little bit again, the waters got muddy. And some folks at APTA lobbied to get a little clarity on advertising. And so there's language in the FAST Act about advertising that should clear things up. Advisory councils. This question comes up a lot. I'm doing a transit plan. I've got an advisory committee. Can I pay for it? Generally, advisory councils or the general costs of local government operations are unallowable unless required by statute or by regulation. The RTAP statute, I think you've got to have an RTAP committee, don't you? That would be an example if there's such a statute. ADA Advisory Committee. When ADA was passed in 1990, we're talking a lot about the ADA recently with the passing of George H.W. 41. He signed the ADA. In 1992, when the rules came out, we had mandatory consultation and outreach requirements in the development of an ADA complementary paratransit plan. That was mandated by regulation. The cost of such a committee would have been allowable. Audit costs. If it's not required under the Single Audit Act, generally audit expenses are not allowable. That said, if a state has requested a program-specific audit, then the state has to pay for it. If you qualify or meet the threshold for a single audit, it's an allowable federal expense. You can bill it 5311. If you don't meet the single audit requirements, but your organization just wishes to have its financial statements reviewed by outside eyes, because you do a lot of fundraising and you need the public's trust and the fiduciary responsibilities and execution of duties of the organization, and you want that independent audit verification that you're doing all the right things, then you can hire a CPA firm, but you can't bill it to FTA. A lot of people make that mistake. I believe that's a best practice, but unfortunately it falls in the unallowable category. And again, it doesn't make you a bad system. I believe that puts you light years ahead to other agencies that do not do outside independent audits of your financial records. So it's a best practice that the feds can't pay for, but you should pay for it as a general rule of thumb, as a best practice. There's an expense that we find a lot of mistakes on. Okay. Now I'll pick on Medicaid again. How many times do we deliver a trip that's supposedly under Medicaid sponsorship? We submit the bill and it gets kicked back because Mary wasn't eligible on the day we provided transport, and Medicaid refuses to pay for the trip. Has that ever happened to you? It happens all over, all the time. And obviously we go to fight with Medicaid and we submit the bill and whatnot. But the whole issue of bad debt, it may make good business sense for our organization to go after people who owe us money by hiring collection agencies, even if necessary, legal services to sue them, or at least write the threatening letters. That may be a sound business practice that I recommend, but the cost of collecting those bad debts is not allowable under federal awards. You can't bill them. If I'm an individual and I get paid and I work on the transit program 100% of my time, the normal payroll records of your organization constitutes satisfactory documentation of the claims that your accounting department makes when you bill GDOT. Well, if I'm an individual who only works part-time on transit and I do other things with my organization, the documentation requirements become very different. So do we have anybody in this room who has employees who work partially in transit and partially for some other agency activity? All right, there's at least a dozen hands raised. This is a very common situation. Their time dedicated to transit is allowable. That's the good news. It must conform to the established written policies of the organization. You've got to treat the employee the same way with transit as you do for whatever else you're charging that employee to. But it is the documentation requirements that change. And I'm going to get to another slide that tells us better. I forgot I slipped it in the seventh slide. You've got to keep documentation. If my time is split between 2 or more federal grants, That means 5310 and 5311. If you're charging my time, I'm a driver, and part of my time is being charged at 5310, part of it to 5311. If I work on a direct activity and an indirect activity, i.e. a portion of my salary is in the indirect cost pool, if I work on an eligible activity, public transit, and an ineligible activity, fundraising, then the documentation requirements for my time basically are a timesheet that lists every single activity that I participated in. It lists all 8 hours of my work day, all 40 hours of my work week, and must be kept in units that correspond to one or more pay periods of my organization. I've got to keep a timesheet, or else my time is not properly documented and will be disallowed by an auditor who knows their stuff. And so what typically happens when I've got nonprofit grantees is I've got the salary of an executive director who may attend this very session and spend 8 hours of their day on transit. But because I'm a big deal in my agency, I don't keep timesheets. I'm the executive director. I don't have to keep a timesheet. I don't make an hourly wage. I make an annual salary. My board of directors doesn't require a timesheet. But if you want to build today's 8 hours as a direct cost of transit grant, you must keep the timesheet. That's what constitutes, it's the only thing that constitutes adequate documentation. It's got to be an actual after-the-fact determination. Another common circumstance, and if I had $1 for every time I ran into this circumstance, I'd be on a beach somewhere in the Caribbean. I'm still working after 43 years. Hi, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit agencies, and we administer 3 programs. They're all about the same size. So I bill 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 of my time to the 3 respective programs. I won't ask if anybody does that, because no one ever raises their hand, because they get the feeling Gary's going to tell them that about you in like 2 seconds, and you'd be absolutely right. Billing time on a percentage basis has never been permissible as adequate documentation for claims of personnel expenses under federal grant awards. People are blaming the super circular, but this has been a long-standing requirement from day one.
The timesheet that you speak of, how much detail per individual should go on the timesheet?
Well, it's got to represent everything you do during the course of the day. And then I mentioned something about the written pay policy of the organization. So basically, the written pay policy of the organization will say something to the effect that for employees, time is split between 2 or more grant activities, allowable, unallowable activity, eligible, ineligible activity. Time shall be kept in 15-minute increments. Kind of borrowing the policy of lawyers. It's got to represent all of your time. So all 8 hours of the day. So that means on days off, I got to have a line item in there to meet vacation days, holiday days, bereavement leave, family maternity leave. Then for my work time, I got to put my transit hours. I got to put my senior center hours. I got to put my weatherization hours, however many grant programs I've got up there. It gets a little complex, and sometimes, quite frankly, I get a lot of kickback on that's just simply too much work. In older versions of the super circular, if you read A87 or A122, these things would be called personal activity reports, or PARs, personnel activity reports. The super circular drops the requirement for PARs because there's some presumption that you're all using electronic timekeeping, and under electronic system you have to account for all 40 hours of your workday. And so they say only in circumstances when a grantor agency determines that the electronic documentation doesn't meet federal requirements, can the federal agency reimpose the PAR requirement. In effect, most agencies are just saying nothing's changed. You still got to keep PARs. And that's the case. That really is the case.
Chris, does this apply to subrecipients as well as third-party operators?
Well, it depends. If I'm paying a third-party operator who's a for-profit corporation, I'm going to go back to my previously articulated model where I'm paying him on an hourly basis.
But if you're not paying on an hourly basis?
Yeah, if it goes to a contractor, if Joe, the president of the Acme Transit Company, says I work 10 hours supervising my employees' provision of service under your contract, I want the 10 hours. When RLS bills Georgia Dot, and I bill you 8 hours for today, it would be within your rights to say to Gary, where's Gary's time record? He worked 8 hours, and it will be 8 hours today. That's reasonable for you to request that.
So the answer is yes.
So the answer is yes. But again, because I think that just gets you into administratively complex invoice processing practices, I look to see if there isn't a better way. And I think the unit pricing model is the better way for both buyer and seller of service.
And that detail level in your mind is unclear. Is 15-minute increments and putting something in there from 8 to 8:15, review emails from the state array. Is that kind of where I'm at here?
You could do it that way. And again, the kickback that one receives is, even in 15-minute increments, I could spend 2 minutes right now on transit. The phone will ring and I'm tied up for an hour on human services. Then later I come back to transit for 5 minutes. You're asking me to do an enormous amount of timekeeping. And that's when we have to invoke Rich's rule of proportionality. When the level of effort to dissect the time charge to a federal grant award exceeds the benefits gained, drop all of that cost into the indirect cost pool and recover the pro rata share of indirect cost through the de minimis rate or an indirect cost rate. And that way, that same person, that executive director who objects to keeping time at that fine level of detail, just fills out his timesheet, General Agency Administration 8888, and you've met the requirements. And then all 8 hours, all 5 days a week, drop into the indirect cost bucket. If I've accurately prepared an indirect cost rate proposal, I'm claiming my indirect costs under my federal grant awards, I'm going to recover my pro rata share of salary expended on transit.
And that number is allowed to fluctuate week over week, depending on where the work goes.
The number of hours or the percentage rate?
Those are total hours.
Total hours will be up all over the map, sure. The rate itself, though, is calculated and applied on an annual basis.
Yeah, I'm talking if we fight against multiple contracts,
Yeah.
it could be 20 hours one week, it could be 40 the next week,
Or zero,
or 0.
exactly,
Okay.
depending on what the program is that month.
Now, let's just say in general that one person was getting a certain set amount per month, and they only did 20 hours the whole entire month of transit to a certain degree. I mean, the 15-minute increments, is there a dollar amount we need to set to this time period that they're?
If 100% of the employee's time is spent on a single activity, transit, they don't need a timesheet, whether they work 16 hours a pay period, 40 hours a pay period, it doesn't matter. If they're dedicated to one and only one activity, exclusive to transit, then the normal payroll records of the agency satisfy as adequate documentation. It's when a single employee, no matter whether they're full-time or part-time, work on That's always been the case. Auditors are not very good at catching that.
Clarification, I believe what she's asking about, like a small 5311 system, where the county bookkeeper does the county business, but the board agreed to pay them $300 a month extra on top of their normal salary, whether it takes them 2 hours to do the transit bookkeeping or 20 hours. Is that right?
Okay. That to me would not be an employee, that is a contract employee in terms of the contract between the transit agency and whoever fostered the agreement, whoever the two parties to the agreement, agreed on a flat rate to perform a service. The same cost and price analysis would have to go into the evaluation as to whether or not that rate was fair and reasonable. And if a determination were made that that was a fair and reasonable rate, given the administrative burdens that 5311 imposes on that individual, that organization, then you can pay the flat rate. But if they're billing a portion of their salary, i.e. their time is split between an eligible federal award and a non-federal award. There's a slide with all the conditions that trigger the PAR requirement in the slideshow. That's when you've got to keep the detailed documentation. And if you think your time is split so fine, or with such detail that it becomes administratively burdensome to keep up with, invoke the rule of proportionality and drop them into the indirect cost pool. And I use as an example, a lot of nonprofits want to try to identify every single penny they can as a direct cost to a grant owner. And in some cases, they'll take utility bills, phone bills in particular. And I'll be walking around a transit agency and I'll see an accounting clerk up on the screen is the accounting system. Over here is a utility statement, and up on her second screen is Excel. I ask what she's doing, and she says, my boss needs me to break down this phone bill so we can charge the direct charges to all of our grant programs. That's what they require. And I asked, how much is the phone bill? Oh, this month's not too bad, $161. How much time will it take you to go through this? And she goes, that's not too bad this month, maybe 8 or 12 hours. So the agency will spend $400 to divvy up a $150 bill. That's what I mean by a level of effort that's disproportionate to the accounting benefits gained. If I were to just dump the whole phone bill into indirect costs, it would be allocated. It might be different than the numbers that she generates out of Excel. But in the scheme of things, it's not going to be different by that much. And I wouldn't have expended the $400 to come up with this somewhat imprecise division or allocation anyway. Some other things that we should be aware of with respect to personnel. I've run into situations where people have paid bonuses for safe driving, and they've not billed it to the grant because they thought it was unallowable. If you have a written personnel payment policy that says if you drive 12 consecutive months without a chargeable accident or some such standard as that, funds permitting, you may be entitled to a $500 cash bonus. If it were in the policy, it would become allowable. But at the end of the year, the executive director just can't make up a bonus schedule and say, hey, you did a good job this year, here's $500. It has to be consistent with the written policies and procedures. Similarly with incentive compensation paid to executives, allowable with limitations. Some special considerations for nonprofits that differ from public agencies. Compensation for boards of directors, unlike a city council or a county commission, which are unallowable. Some are allowable for nonprofits. You could pay for the board of directors' time and travel. Special documentation for individuals that work is what we've been talking about. Fringe benefits generally allowable, but within certain limitations. You've got to look up the specific benefit that you're paying and make sure it fits the parameters within the super circular. Depreciation. Generally, grants management 101 says depreciation on federally acquired equipment is unallowable. And that is 100% accurate. But if you are required to bring certain assets to the project to successfully complete the project, i.e., there's not enough money in your 5311 budget for you to build a maintenance facility. We all would agree that maintenance on system vehicles is a necessary option. You go out and buy a building with local funds for the 5311 program maintenance. Depreciation on that building would be an allowable expense. It's the share of a building borne in whole or in part by the federal government, which is unallowable. So if you buy a building with local funds, straight line depreciation over 40 years would be allowable. But again, with the caveat that that's going to be a big chunk of change. And there's only so much 5311 monies you get. And if it goes towards depreciation of real property, it's not going towards gas, driver salaries, and mobility. And most people just simply won't claim depreciation. But it is allowable as long as it meets the criteria that we exclude the cost of land and any portion of that building that was paid for by the federal government. Membership, subscriptions, professional activities. What this conference is being sponsored by an association, correct? Membership in the association is allowable. What's unallowable is if you were to join the Jekyll Island Country Club and entertain drivers. You couldn't pay for that. Travel coming to Jekyll Island, generally allowable, consistent with your written travel policies. For those of you who do not have travel reimbursement policies in writing, be careful. Because an auditor could disallow all your travel expenses because the super circular does add the caveat of travel expenses being allowable consistent with your own reimbursement policy. No policy, some auditors will say no allowability, period. So adopt them if you don't already have such policies. And OMB gives you options about using actual cost basis, some type of per diem, maybe a combination of the two. But the key thing here is it's got to be consistent with your written reimbursement policies. All right, some of the things that hopefully go without saying that are unallowable. Entertainment. You know, it's always amazing to me, our company specializes in FTA, drug and alcohol, consultation, audit services and the like. And when Robbie Sarles or Linda come out and does an 8-hour workshop, I can count on 50% of the participants after 8 hours of learning the dangers and the ill effects of abuse of alcohol, go straight to the bar. Which is all fine, well and good from this wine liker. But the cost of alcohol unallowable. You can't go home and claim your bar cost because that's unallowable. Fines and penalties. Your driver gets a ticket, you pay for it, you can't bill GDOT. People have done that. The cost of city council or county board of county commissioners, ineligible. Good goods or services for personal consumption, unallowable. One of my Wall of Shame members hired a contractor to deliver transit services, then required to drive one of the drivers to cut his grass. Unallowable. Lobbying. Here's where association membership can get a little tricky to the state DOT when they see those costs on your invoicing. The costs of lobbying are unallowable. So typically, if an association does lobbying, either the state DOT won't pay for association costs, or they will require the due statement to contain a breakdown. Here's your $2,000 annual assessment, $1,200 is for member services, $800 is used for lobbying. $1,200 then would be allowable costs, the $800 would be unallowable costs associated with association membership. If you've signed a contract with Medicaid, you lost $1,000, you cannot bill $1,000 worth of operating expenses to the 5311 grant. That is unallowable. Losses from other contracts and grant awards, you just take the loss on your financial statements. You can't recover it from some other grant. Yeah.
We're gonna need to take a time out because the luncheon is starting at noon and it's just a few minutes till.
5 up, and I was going to do that after lunch, so you just got me about 30 seconds.
I wasn't sure.
We're going to come back, we're going to do, look at who you're sitting next to. I hope you like them because I only do group exercises. And we're going to do a group exercise on cost allowability when we come back from lunch at 1:30. No, I've got a lot more on costs. Especially indirect and direct costs. All right, we will convene at 1:30. Right back here.